Greetings, I am Steve Clemons, contributing editor at The Hill. Thank you so much for joining us for our event, 50 Plus Women Voters and the Midterms. A consistent voter, women over 50 will once again make their voices heard in the November elections. The midterms come at a time when inflation and the rising cost of living are squeezing American households. Powering these households and feeling the pinch are women over 50 who typically turn up in large numbers for midterm elections and could be deciding the fate of the House and the Senate and many other races in the country for that matter. What are the priorities of 50 plus women voters? Do they feel seen and heard by their country and their elected officials? What issues are top of mind as they head to the polls? Today we're going to attempt to answer these questions and more. But before we get underway, a few housekeeping notes. You can tweet us at The Hill events using the hashtag #TheHillMidterms. We're broadcasting live and we'll take your questions throughout the program. And if you experience any trouble with the live stream, just refresh the page. To set the stage for us today, we will begin with our panel of experts who have crunched the numbers and can share the top priorities for this important voter group. Clarissa Martínez de Castro is the Vice President of the Latino Vote Initiative at UnidosUS. She can share the results of recent polling on Hispanic voters and the midterms. Kate Ryan is Vice President of Policy and Strategic Initiatives at the Institute for Women's Policy Research, a fantastic place and a reservoir of data. She works there to accelerate change in the lives of women and families. And finally, Nancy LeaMond is the Executive Vice President and Chief Advocacy and Engagement Officer at AARP. AARP has conducted a number of surveys of this demographic. I should say that AARP is the sponsor of today's event, and I'm very grateful for that. But I will not have a discussion on this event without Nancy LeaMond in it because she is one of the leading editorial experts. So we're very, very grateful to have that. It's not normally the policy of the Hill to do that, but we're pleased to do that today. So listen, it's great to have all of you with us. And let me just sort of open with you, Nancy, and sort of, come into this question and say, as you've just commissioned a set of polls, and in these polls, when you look at the dashboard of concerns of particularly women over 50, and as they're looking at this next election, what is top of mind to this group?
Well, first of all, Steve, thanks for having me, and thanks for doing this program. We obviously think it's important, and I'm delighted to be here on this panel. First point I want to make is perhaps to reiterate what you just said. We expect women over the age of 50 to be a particularly important voting bloc this time around. They're a big group. There are 63 million people, women over the age of 50. They turn out to vote. Older women cast 30% of the ballots in 2020, while they represented 25% of the voting age population. And third point, most important right now, they're a key swing voting bloc. Women are fairly evenly divided by party, but today we want to talk about how roughly half of them told us in a couple of weeks ago that they had not yet made up their minds how they were going to vote. Quickly to get to your first question, what are they thinking about? Most of them are thinking about the economy. Of course, women over the age of 50 are not a monolith. And so what we found in our survey is depending on what group you are, you might have a slightly different set of issues, but the economy is really at the top for virtually everyone. And I don't think that would surprise people, reflecting all those fears about economic instability and also political discord.
One of the things, Nancy, that has struck me, I want to bring Clarissa and Kate into this as well, is that Gallup has done a poll. It's kind of an interesting, little bit of an odd poll. It's not just the United States, but it covers the United States, but also globally, looking at women and saying that women, by any measure, have never been as stressed out as they are right now. That when you kind of look at all of the different stresses, health stresses, social stresses, coming out of COVID, the economic scramble to pay the bills, to get the drugs, to be, caretakers for those that are in need. And I should say both men and women can be caretakers in this. But the stress levels are very high. And I'm just interested in whether we are hearing that, whether, we're hearing that there's a human cry that's more than what money are they getting. I mean, it's just sort of the human part of policy, which I know it's sort of a meta topic and not a Facebook topic, but kind of a big topic. But Nancy, just your thoughts on that. Are we getting it wrong?
Well, it is certainly true that women over the age of 50, we did focus groups in the spring, and the overwhelming message from those women was that they felt invisible. They felt that public officials did not understand their day-to-day lives, were not talking about issues that resonated with them. And, I've been at a lot of focus groups over the many years I've worked on these issues. And I have to say, I was really taken aback by the level of kind of frustration and concern, so much so that we've just recently launched a campaign, social media, In My Shoes, where we invited women to tell us kind of what their story is or what they would want policymakers to focus on. We had 33,000 stories come to us within a few days. And I think this speaks to the fact that they don't feel seen as you said, as caregivers, as the kind of deciders in the family about healthcare, as the providers, and as the main jugglers of everything that has to go on.
Well, thank you. Clarissa, I'm such a fan of UnidosUS, as you know, Janet Mejia, many of your colleagues, and have talked with them so frequently on basically how Hispanic women are seeing their terrain, what are their priorities, and my understanding is you've done some of your own polling to get a sense of what's high on the list and what some of the big seismic shifts, the big shocks in this election are, Supreme Court cases perhaps being one of them, but I'm just interested in how the constituency you've been talking to is seeing this upcoming election.
Thank you, Steve, and thanks, Nancy and Kate, for the opportunity to join you in this conversation. We're delighted to be here. I was listening to a story on the polling that AARP did, and there was so much in that, even though it's focused on women over 50, that resembles not only Hispanic women voters over 50, but the Hispanic electorate as a whole. To your question, Steve, so among the top priorities for the electorate, and this was a very robust national and multi-state poll, what we saw is that there was a seismic shift among some of the priorities. By that, I mean gun violence reached the second top priority, in abortion, the number 5, which it has never been at that level. And there was also an exclamation point put after some issues that have been historically at the top of Latino voters' agenda: the economy and jobs, the cost of healthcare, and rising in that scale also housing. But to tracking back to the bridge between these two, the Latino constituency overall and women over 50, I would say that for Latina voters over 50, also the inflation is part of that exclamation point on pocketbook issues. And it's not surprising, right? If we think back during the pandemic, which we haven't fully emerged from, Hispanics were disproportionately impacted, and women in particular, Latinas in the workforce, ended up with a heavier load on family care, child care, that they had to respond to during shutdowns, schools in particular. So the community is still reeling from that, and the disproportionate effects were both health and economic. So then you add the current environment with inflation, and it's no surprise that inflation is at the top. But with that, also jobs, right? And the reasons there are similar across Latino voters, I would say, that jobs just don't pay enough to make ends meet. The one thing that emerged slightly different for Latina women over 50, and I think that goes with some of the story that Nancy's telling, is that in addition to their concerns about jobs being that they don't pay enough and that they're having to pick up extra shifts because there's a shortage of workers, some of these women also said that they are concerned they're having to deal with a lot of hostile customers or that they don't feel safe in the workplace.
Well, Clarissa, let me ask one just other deeper question on this. I've talked to Nancy for years about 50 plus women voters being the most dependable voter, that they're the ones who say they're going to vote, and guess what? They do vote. You go talk to young people, they say they're going to go vote, and they don't go vote. I mean, I know some of you watching right now are young people and you're going to go vote, and I really want you to do that. But it's just in proportion. You know, this voting block is a very, very important voting block. And I told Nancy LeaMond once, I said, they're sort of the taken for granted voter, because it's like all these other votes that are less dependable, the system chases much more vigorously. And like the 50 plus women's voters, not chased at all. And I'm just interested in the Hispanic community, is your level of engagement with the electoral system, with voting. You know, are issues of voting rights very important in the Hispanic community? As much as they are in the broad community. I'm just interested in whether there are nuances we should be aware of there.
Yes, every election cycle we see a lot of mistaken assumptions or misconceptions about Hispanic voters overall. And of course, some of them also apply to Hispanic women voters overall and those over 50. As a whole, Latinos experience great underinvestment and underengagement from parties and candidates. And that also extends to the demographic of Latinas over 50. And the interesting thing, I think Latinos are sending a wake-up call to both parties. To some extent, you could say that Democrats have coasted on the Republicans being their own worst enemy where it comes to Hispanic voters. But rather than fight to solidify those levels of support, I think that there's a lack of understanding that there is a swing element among Hispanic voters. And so, to Nancy's point, I think particularly right now, when the economy is number one, we see that voters tend to think Republicans are better suited to respond to the economy. And on other issues like healthcare, like abortion, like gun violence, they think Democrats are better suited. In other words, the message here is you have to court these voters. And so far, we haven't seen a commensurate response to try to go after their support.
Well, thank you. Kate, let me ask you the same question about what's on the dashboard. You know, recently, I've been engaging a lot of the party officials in both Democratic Party and Republican Party. Both sides, of course, see it slightly differently about what the priorities are. If you talk to the Republican side, they sort of see the Dobbs decision as fading and economic anxiety rising along with gas prices at the pump and inflation numbers, et cetera. And if you talk to the Democrats, they think the Dobbs decision is an exogenous shock that's really been a game changer out there. But other matters, other issues matter as well. But IWPR, the Institute for Women's Policy Research, tweeted out something, and I think it's important to put it out there, and said that Black women's unemployment rate fell from 5.9 to 5.4% recently, while white women's unemployment has gone from 2.8 to 2.6%. And you sort of look at those levels, there's still a 2-for-1 difference in those levels. Now, this is not age-based, but it gives you a sense that, you know, at certain level, I mean, it comes back again, not to overtalk about Nancy LeaMond, but Nancy LeaMond taught me one time that the future of retirement is work. And as you're looking at this for elder, your 50-plus women who are in the workforce, you know, what does it say both about the disparities we have on race, but on the economic stress that people are feeling from your research?
Absolutely. And thank you, Steve. And absolutely keep referring to Nancy. I agree. Thank you, Clarissa. The issue we're seeing is that economic security is top of mind for women, but that is deeply tied in women's actual day-to-day lives with the wage gap, with their income disparities, with the fact of the Dobbs decision, both for women who are impacted potentially personally, but also older women voters are the women who are in the streets marching for Roe. That hits everybody. And we also know that access to abortion is an economic security issue. IWPR actually did research put out last year looking at the fact that abortion restrictions actually cost women and state economies $105 billion annually in lost earnings.
Say that number one more time. Million or billion?
Billion, $105 billion annually in lost earnings, turnover. So access to abortion is an economic security issue. And it is deeply tied in women's lives, as has been discussed, with childcare. I can say during the pandemic, I have young children, and I can say it impacted my work experience. But I will also say for women voters over 50, my mother and my mother-in-law were who were helping, and how that impacts their retirement, their economic security. One is still working, one is not. But the fact that retirement security is also top of mind, all of these issues are tied together for women in their day-to-day lives. And so the pandemic, the way in which it hit women over 50, some have regained their pre-pandemic levels of employment, but for women 65 and over, that has not been the case. And that is a deep stressor on economic security. So these are directly related issues.
Oh, fascinating. Nancy, and all of you, as we sort of look at neglected, forgotten, demeaned voters who matter, what is happening in terms of political organization, political pressure? What are the ways in which this important voting group that has priorities and that has problems and anxieties it wants the political system to respond to, what are you seeing in terms of the ways in which they're communicating that and which they might get traction in the future? Nancy?
Well, we're seeing attention to, I think, all the groups that the panel's talked about now as we get closer to the election. And I think part of that is the recognition that women of all ages, and especially women over the age of 50, are going to be major factors in what happens. And particularly for the 50 plus, we know they are going to turn out. And one of the findings in our poll that really, really surprised me was the importance of Social Security. Kate mentioned retirement security focus, all ages. And, I probably get paid to talk about Social Security, so it doesn't surprise folks. But what really blew us away in the survey was how important concerns about Social Security being there were for not just women over the age of 65, but shockingly for women 50 to 64 years old. And in fact, 3/4 say that Social Security being protected from cuts would help them a lot personally. And that was higher than lowering the cost of food, gas, or healthcare. So these are women thinking a lot about their future, thinking about how economically disadvantaged they are both today and tomorrow, and how important Social Security is going to be.
So real quickly, Nancy, how is your community responding to this 8.7% increase in benefits next year? I mean, the biggest increase in 40 years. Now, I have to say, 8.7% when you've got 8.1% inflation nets out to 0.6% net growth. But who's counting? Right. But how do they feel?
Well, very positive, obviously. And remember, roughly 50% of people over the age of 65 have Social Security as their primary, if not sole, source of income. So that additional 8 increase is going to be very, very important. They're very positive about it. And I think you're going to hear more about Social Security in the next few weeks.
Well, Clarissa, your thoughts?
Well, on that point, right, like we talked about the priorities overall for the community, it is important to note that for Latina voters over 50, Social Security and Medicare were their number 4 priority. So that very much corresponds to what Nancy is saying. I think that one of the things we continue to fight to address the deep hit on the employment situation of Latinas and the challenges they're facing with childcare as they need to re-enter or get solidified in the workforce. The other thing I would say is that just as there are misconceptions and mistaken assumptions about Hispanic voters overall, I've heard in some places say, well, women over 50 are not of childbearing age, so maybe abortion is not such a big issue. Well, as it is for Latinos in terms of the vast majority of Latinos, including Latinas over 50, 70% of them believe that regardless of their personal belief, it is wrong to make abortion illegal and to take that right away from everybody else. But there's also deep support for extending policies like the Earned Child Tax Credit, like childcare supports and food supports for working families. And part of it is because the Latino community, many of us are in intergenerational households, and older women take care of grandkids or are part of this support system in the family. So all those issues end up very interconnected, even if some folks may assume, well, they're not dealing with those things anymore, so they don't care. It's not true.
Well, thank you. And your thoughts as well, Kate?
I really want to agree with Nancy and Clarissa. I think to the point of Social Security, women depend on Social Security more than men do as a percentage of their income in retirement. There are more Social Security beneficiaries are women than men. So Social Security as a top issue is essential. And to your point, Steve, around tying it to inflation, it's why the increased cost of living and inflation is so impactful and immediate as folks are making decisions at the grocery store. And to the point around childcare and intergenerational households, COVID increased that a lot, right? We saw a lot of intergenerational care as folks formed bubbles and depended on parents. Obviously, I gave my personal example, and there are many more anecdotal stories to that effect. And so the fact of not having paid family and medical leave, the piece of access to abortion, these are intergenerational issues, and they are also, people feel strongly that, for example, abortion being made illegal, they don't support it across the board.
Let me just do a quick round robin here real quick, because you just said something really interesting, Kate, which was about these other, family medical leave and about other dimensions of support. Some of this was going to be in Build Back Better, the big Democratic, Biden administration Build Back Better bill. That blew up. And now we have the Inflation Reduction Act, and almost no one remembers Build Back Better. And I think a lot of both progressives and people that are more pragmatic are saying, oh, we've got the IRA. Are there elements of the IRA that satisfy, I should say, the working women, 50-plus women's voters' needs enough that they're satisfied? Or is there a lingering disappointment that not enough was accomplished? So, Kate, you first, and we'll go to Clarissa and give Nancy the last word.
I think the IRA had great things in it. I would note, for example, prescription drug costs, the climate pieces, right? There are important things in the IRA, but there are still concerns around things like paid family and medical leave, things that didn't make it in to the IRA, right? That had been in part Build Back Better. And so it is, I think, really important, including to women 50 and over who tend to care for their families as a whole. And so to limit the issues they care about to things that might impact their children, they're still mothers, and they do still right in the context of caring as grandmothers, that is still important to them. And I think that Nancy's and Clarissa's polling has shown
that. Clarissa?
Not enough. I think that certainly important steps, but obviously given the road to recovery and the acute impact of the pandemic and now the economic situation, folks need more. I would say that, again, folks are these voters are sending a wake-up call to the parties. And I believe that Latinas over 50, as well as Latinos overall, their growth in the electorate could help strengthen a stabilizing force in our politics. A couple of things that are shared across the board, but for Latinas over 50, for them, candidates who are supported by hate groups or white supremacists is a deal breaker for 54% of them. 47 would not be able to support a candidate who participated in the January 6th riots. 45% would be completely opposed to somebody who supports a complete ban on abortions, and 43% would oppose somebody who is opposed to immigration reform with a path to citizenship. But there we go back to this critical point. Meaningful outreach matters. And if candidates are not reaching out and making their positions and their positions of their opponents known, then they may not be able to capitalize on those areas where they may have an advantage.
Absolutely fascinating. Nancy LeaMond, last word.
Well, we know in every recent election, the cost of healthcare has been a very, very important issue. And the Inflation Reduction Act dealt with the cost of healthcare in terms of prescription drugs, an issue we worked on for many years, and also the premium costs in the Affordable Care Act, among others. So no question there's value, particularly for older women voters, in that piece of legislation. Is there more to do? Absolutely. Absolutely. We need to look at many of the issues that Kate and Clarissa have mentioned now, and probably a few others we haven't had a chance to talk about. So much more to be done on behalf of women of all ages.
Well, what a fascinating conversation. I know I added a few minutes to it, but I think it was worth it. Clarissa Martínez de Castro, Vice President of the Latino Vote Initiative at UnidosUS. So great to talk to you. Kate Ryan, Vice President of Policy and Strategic Initiatives at the Institute for Women's Policy Research. They have a great Twitter feed. And Nancy LeaMond, Executive Vice President and Chief Advocacy and Engagement Officer at AARP. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, Steve.
Bye, Nancy and Kate.